really, at that time, there was a requirement, there was a recognition that we needed this, but there was not many options open whereby we could get additional ships and submarines. But also during the latter part of the 70s, we were able to acquire further 3 strike-craft missile boats from Israel and also built a further 6 locally. Now, one needs to say that in terms of protecting our sovereignty and also the people and our territorial waters of this country, the strike-craft that we acquired during the 70s did render excellent service to Chairperson, and they provided an excellent surface warfare offensive capability. However, they totally lacked an anti-submarine warfare capability, and as has already been testified to before this commission, in the Second World War, more than 133 ships were actually lost to submarine type action around here. So the fact that we did not have an anti-submarine capability certainly weighed very heavily on the minds of the naval planners of the day. Furthermore, these ships lacked the ability to carry a helicopter, and as a result of that, because the strike-craft did not carry a helicopter, they were severely limited in their over-the-horizon surveillance ability, scouting, as well as targeting or attacking at range. Yesterday, we also heard, Chairperson, the size of our sea waters around the coast, and if you do not have an over-the-horizon capability, then you have a very limited surveillance capability. And then lastly, as anyone that served on those vessels would testify, in adverse weather conditions around our coast, they really were not the most pleasant vessels to serve in, and their operational capability was severely reduced because of the way in which they rode the seas.
Admiral Schutz, thanks for the background. Starting as early as 1885, expeditiously going to 1921, 1955, 1975, and the history of acquisition. Of significance, you are rehashing what your colleagues have said about the vulnerability of South Africa, the importance of the Cape Sea route, but more significantly, that even prior to 1994, the frigates and the submarines have played a significant role in as far as the Navy is concerned.
That is correct, Chairperson. The frigates and the submarines were certainly the backbone of the South African Navy throughout my career, and during the period that we did not have frigates, their loss was keenly felt.
Paragraph 8, proceed.
Chairperson, paragraph 8 just reads that as a result of the arms embargo, South Africa thus found itself in a position where it was not able to satisfy its needs for additional multi-mission capable ships. And here I need to stress the multi-mission capable ships and submarines. As I've tried to indicate, the strike-craft only fulfilled warfare in one dimension.
You are confirming that throughout, acquisition has always been on the mind of the South African Navy and the then government of those times.
That is correct, Chairperson. Essentially, when we purchase vessels, we look at a lifespan of about 30 years, and given that the run-up in terms of acquiring a new capability can take up to 10 years, therefore, normally speaking, after approximately 20 years in service of a platform, we look towards its replacement. Now, specifically with regards to the frigates and their eventual replacement, that started as early as 1980 with the formulation of Naval Staff Target 6 of 1980.
Let me take the liberty to lead you into paragraph 9. With respect to acquiring new surface combatants, Naval Staff Target 6 of stroke 80 was raised in 1980, specifying the need for 6 vessels to be acquired during the period 1987 to 1991. Is it correct to say, even as early as then, there were processes that governed acquisition in as far as South African Navy is concerned?
Chairperson, I lost the one word during the microphone. If you can just repeat that too.
In this paragraph, I refer you to Naval Staff Target 6, stroke 80, which was raised in 1980, specifying the need for 6 vessels to be acquired during the period 1987 to 1991. Now, my question is based on this. Is it appropriate to say, even prior to 1994, there were processes that govern acquisition in as far as South African Navy is concerned?
That is correct, Chair.
Is that the reason why Naval Staff Target 6, stroke 80, is there? And I would like you just to take the Commission about its importance in as far as the process of acquisition is concerned.
Chairperson, the Naval Staff Target 6 of 80 was the kickstart to looking towards the eventual replacement of the frigates. Now, these frigates arrived, as I indicated, in 1960. I think the last one of the 3 that we purchased arrived in 1963. So we were reaching that 20-year period when one starts the process to replace. And that's why the Naval Staff Target was raised in terms of the then process. Specifically, if one goes to page 11 at PS2, it then outlines the primary reasons and what it indicates, Chair, on paragraph 8 of that document is that we must be capable of conducting active defense in the vital and territorial waters and to project a credible offensive posture in the tactical and strategic areas of the country.
Admiral Schutz, please do me a favor. When you testify, let's be certain whether the commissioners are with us. You could look at them when you want to refer them to a document. And thanks for simplifying the process because you identify the annexure and the page. But let's just affirm whether the commissioners are on the same page. Commissioners, the witness is referring to annexure PS2 on page 11. Annexure PS2, page 11. It starts from page 11 to page 13, but the witness is drawing your attention to page 11. Just to refresh you, I know that it's still on your mind. The witness is talking about a process called Naval Staff Target 6/80, and he is trying to demonstrate that it was in place and what was its purpose. We need a signal that the commissioners are on page 11. I see that Commissioner Moose is nodding. Chairperson, you may proceed, sir. The witness is referring you to paragraph 8 on the self-same page. You may proceed, Admiral Schutz.
Thank you, Chair. I was raising paragraph 8 on that page, page 11, to say that the concept at this stage was that we must be capable of conducting active defensive as well as project credible defense. So the concept again of protecting the territorial integrity of our country was very much alive in 1980, and recognizing that the frigates that were acquired in the 60s would not be with us forever, this staff target was then raised in 1980, in February, to kickstart the process of acquiring replacements for the then frigates. Over the page, a chairperson on page 12, it then continues, if one looks there in paragraph 10, and it speaks again specifically, if I may draw your attention to paragraph 10b of subsurface attacks. And I illustrate that because the question could be asked, why not just the strike craft? And again, a frigate has have an anti-submarine warfare capability, which the strike craft doesn't have, and therefore the strike craft could not satisfy this requirement, and that was raised in 6 of 80. And if I may then also draw your attention to paragraph 11, at that stage in 1980 it was envisaged that 6 vessels would eventually be acquired to replace the 3 frigates which were now getting very old. But one must bear in mind that the visas that were cancelled in 77 were also there to augment the 3. So this was not really an expansion of the force level, but it was an attempt to get back to the force levels that we were not able to satisfy in the early to mid-70s. Thank you, sir.
Please, let's go back and look at paragraph 9 on the same page. And might take the liberty to read it to you. The need is to acquire sufficient vessels to satisfy the military function of the South African Navy. Now, this confirms that even as early as 1980, there was a need to update, there was a need to acquire, and there was a process that had to be followed to satisfy the capabilities of the South African Navy.
That is correct, Chair.
Please look at paragraph 13 on the same page. One also sees that cost and budget have always been an issue, even as early as the 80s, in as far as the acquisition process is concerned.
That is correct, Chair.
Now, you may proceed with your testimony. Are we going back to paragraph 9?
Continue then with my testimony on in respect of paragraph 9, but now reading from the page 3, would like to just then indicate that, or re-emphasize that at this stage it was because of the lifespan of the frigates that was coming to an end, and also furthermore that eventually they did come to an end very shortly thereafter. In 1982, as was indicated yesterday, we lost 1 in a tragic accident, and in 1985 the remaining 2 were finally decommissioned and taken out of service. So at the end of 1985, the Navy lost its surface anti-submarine warfare capability.
You may proceed to the next paragraph, paragraph 10.
Chairperson, I've already alluded to this in the Naval Staff target of 680 that I previously showed you, or went through at PS2, that we were looking at ships that would have the following capabilities. They would be able to do surface missile attacks. They would be able to do subsurface attacks. They would be able to lay mines if required, both offensive and defensive laying of mines. They could be used at sea for training platforms for young officers and sailors coming up through the ranks. Again, having only small ships in the Navy at that stage, very limited in their ability to offer accommodation to carry extra people for training purposes. obviously they would have to have a self-defensive capability and defend themselves, and this primarily normally refers to the attack from aircraft, and then also be used for limited intelligence gathering.
What draws my attention on the self-same paragraph is what you see on line number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, starting with due to a lack of funds. Can you see? Due to a lack of funds, starting from the top of paragraph 10. Please read it.
So due to a lack of funds, Project Outward, which was a project that was registered in order to acquire that which this naval staff target set out to acquire, remained dormant until 1989, at which point it was superseded by a further project, Project Foreshore, and the detail around how that came about, I have referred to one of the enclosures, sir, but of importance is that what really changed in the period from when Naval Staff Target 6 of 80 was first raised up till the time when Project Foreshore came about was that the requirement was now for 4 multi-purpose vessels that would be delivered between a period of 1997 to 2002. So already one can see how we have shifted from 1987 to 1997, 10 years in the time frame of when we expected a replacement for the frigates, and also a reduction in the number from 6 to 4.
Just to complete this part of your testimony, why is there a reference to Project Outward, Project Foreshore, Project Falcon? I know that we're going to hear a lot of projects. Please simplify that.
Chairperson, when we embark on an acquisition of any capability, we normally register that particular project with both a file reference and a code name, so that when we speak colloquially about it, you can refer to the code name. So normally the code name would be unclassified, but the meaning of that code name would be classified. And also for security reasons, these code names were at certain stages changed, also for security reasons. So one could find that Outward, Foreshore, Falcon, although different names, would actually be about the same capability that was being acquired.
I would like you to put your cap on as a member of the South African National Defence Force at this stage, particularly after having laid a foundation on the subject of projects. Let's look at the current acquisition of the packages, SDPP, which is the subject of this commission. Was there a project that was associated with acquiring equipment for the Navy?
There was, Chair, in terms of the current SDP packages, it was Project Citron with respect to the frigates and Project Wills with respect to the submarines.
I know that there are better people to come and speak on behalf of the Air Force. Remember, I've requested you to put your cap on as a member of the SANDF. What about the Air Force?
Chairperson, I would probably give you the wrong names of their projects. I do know that the maritime segment later for the frigates in terms of the helicopter was Project Maulstick, but I would rather not venture on the Air Force's projects.
Do you have an idea about Project Nkosi?
I'm going to speculate, Chairperson.
It's not that important. It's just that I wanted you to complete the picture, because projects will be coming up. But what has become palpable before the Commission, that which we can touch, is that in as far as the Navy is concerned, the acquisitions in as far as the SDPP packages are concerned, when you look at frigates and you wanted to acquire frigates, the project that regulated that was called Project Citrin. And when you look at the need and the acquisition in as far as the submarines are concerned, the project that regulated that was called Project Wells. We'll still come back to that. Am I right? Now, you may proceed from where we left, and just to refresh you, it's after Project Falcon. That's line number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You've got to start where you refer us to Annexure PS3. Are you with me, Admiral Schutz?
Chairperson, the annexure marked PS3, which is at page 14 of my bundle. If I may then proceed, sir, I've already alluded to how this came about, the fact that Project Outward was terminated, Project Foreshore was then brought into being and later named Project Falcon. And that is the paragraph 3 speaks to that of the document on page 14, where it says, if I may read paragraph 3, the Navy launched Project Outward in the 1980s, the original intention being to replace the Type 12 frigates with corvette-sized vessels. And then Project Outward was subsequently renamed and frozen in 1989. If I may go down to paragraph 5b, where it says, with regards specifically to the strike craft, as I've previously also indicated, they are unsuitable for possible development into effective anti-submarine platforms. We did look at that possibility in the Navy, but the whole design and the noise that one would get from that type of platform would not make them in any way suitable for anti-submarine warfare. Furthermore, Chair, if I may continue on page 15 in paragraph C, also indicated that the strike craft were totally unsuitable for command and control platforms, again due to size and restrictions of available space. And this just goes to show why we could not say, well, you've got the strike craft, they satisfy your needs, and why the need to replace the frigates that we lost in 85 was a persistent need that we were still trying to satisfy, and that is further illustrated, if I may continue, to paragraph 6 below, the last sentence, also on page 15, which says, the new generation surface combat vessels will utilize certain components of the scrapped strike craft, existing weapon systems, and in addition will, and then it indicates once again the requirement for a helicopter, the requirement for anti-submarine capability, and the command and control. So even as early as April 1990, there was this concept in our minds that once we get new frigates, they will in part rely on equipment that was on the strike craft or developed for an upgrade path of the strike craft. And then lastly, with regards to this part and what happened at this juncture in April 1990, paragraph 8 is the indication that we wanted the first vessel by 1997 and the fourth vessel by 2002. And this would have been some 7 years after the last frigate was in service.
Please recapitulate, go back to paragraph 6. May I take the liberty to read it to you just to show the relevance of something that your colleague, Admiral Green mentioned in as far as rejuvenation is concerned. Commissioners, page 15, paragraph 6. With the withdrawal from operation service of the President-class frigates, the SAN, standing for South African Navy abbreviation, lost its all-weather patrol and service anti-submarine capability as well as the means for effective command and control of units at sea. Let's pause there. Now, was this loss really so serious that it affected the Navy?
Chairperson, the essence of a force design is balance, and one needs a balanced portfolio of capabilities. The reality is that frigates cannot sweep mines, by way of analogy, and certainly if you do not have a balanced portfolio, then you are vulnerable in that area where you lack. And the fact that with the loss of the frigates, we lost the ability to do over-the-horizon scouting, over-the-horizon targeting, and certainly, from a surface perspective, anti-submarine warfare operations made the South African Navy vulnerable in these areas. In fact, if submarines of other countries traversed around our coast, if they entered our territorial waters, we would be totally oblivious of that fact as far as surface vessels being on patrol out there, because none of them would know if one of those ships passed beneath them. So from that point, there was a vulnerability, and it was that vulnerability which we seek to address.
Now, let's read further on the self-same paragraph from where we ended. The SA Navy's present surface patrol and strike capability is vested in the 9 Minister-class strike craft. It is foreseen that these craft will need to be progressively withdrawn from operational service from 1995 onwards because of hull fatigue. Now, is this addressing rejuvenation?
Chair, as I indicated previously, the strike craft were not really acquired as a result of the normal procurement process followed by the Department of Defense. It was a political interjection at the time. So in the minds of the Navy, we were still pursuing to get a better balanced capability in terms of having frigates. And these projects, where initially it started as to revitalize your frigate capability, it migrated to a point where you no longer had that capability, so you wanted to re-establish a capability. We did recognize that we had the strike craft. We, at this stage, did not foresee rejuvenating them. They would eventually be replaced by the frigates. However, as time stepped on and it became apparent that the procurement of the frigates would be rather later than sooner, we then started projects to rejuvenate and extend the life of the strike craft. In fact, we anticipated after that effort that by 2007 we would see the last of the strike craft departing service, and already mention has been made of Project Biro, the offshore patrol vessel that they would then eventually take over from the strike craft, but in a more limited role, that they would not be surface attack craft, but they would then form the basis of our future patrol capability around our own coasts. When it became apparent that Biro 2 has the potential to move further to the right, we've embarked on yet another round of upgrading the 4 strike craft that remain within the South African Navy. In fact, one had already had ministerial approval for disposal, and we've had that ministerial approval revoked that we can upgrade the vessel. And when I say upgrade, we've downgraded the weapons capabilities. We've stripped out the missiles and electronic warfare equipment and the likes. We've replaced the radars with commercial radars, but we've done an upgrade on the hull. When I say upgrade, a repair mainly. so that they can see service until such time as Project Biro can deliver its ships. So this did not deal with this enclosure did not deal with the upgrade path of the strike craft, but merely referred to the fact that they had certain limitations, that we were still looking at a frigate capability.
To appreciate the theme of what you say, and I stand corrected, would I be correct to say at this stage you were talking about revitalization and replacement?
Chairperson, that is correct. It is an ongoing process. From the day you take something into service, you look to the day when you will have to either revitalize it through a half-life refit or eventually replace it.
Thank you, Admiral Schutz. Let's proceed from where you left. We're still on paragraph 10 on page 3.
What next transpired then was that this endeavor around the Project Foreshore and Falcon was also cancelled around about 1991, in July of that year. Again, a lack of funds being cited at the time. And what then followed was 2 years later, in May of 1993, where the same original naval staff requirement was taken, it was revised, and that staff requirement then formed the basis of Project Citron, which eventually delivered the frigates under the SDPP.
Now, would I be correct to say, if one were to look at the process that started as a basis for the current Project Citron, one has to go back to as early as 1993?
Chairperson, I would say 1993 was the final hurdle that was crossed in order for us acquiring the current ships, but the true basis started as early as 1980.
Thank you for the clarity, Admiral Schutz. You may proceed.
Chairperson, I then referred to the document attached as PS4, but I've spoken to that, and that is at page 22 and 23, and in particular, on page 23, paragraph 2, is what I've just spoken to when I said that in 1989, when the first project was cancelled, and then eventually giving rise to Foreshore and Falcon, and again cancelled in 1991. And then in 1993, sir, if I can go back to page 3 of... We then had a staff target that was approved, revision 2, and we proceeded with down selection to the point where by 1994-95 we started with going out on tendering for the possible replacement of the frigates and or corvettes as they were by now being referred to. So by the time that 1994-95 arrived, we had already looked at, I say we, the Navy, in terms of acquisition, at some 42 different ships from 16 countries. And certain down selections had been made, and then eventually in May 95, the whole process was once again deferred when the Minister of Defence indicated that we must await the outcome of the white paper on defence as well as the defence review.
I would like you to look at PS4, page 22. let's start with the date. This document is dated 24 May 1993. Now, is this date telling us that as at that time, our country was gravitating towards transition, the then government was still in place, there were negotiations, I suppose the date of the elections was about to be set. But what comes out of this, it's a process that we start to see that as at that stage before the transition comes, where we start to look at post-1994, a number of things and processes governing acquisition were prevalent. We still see reference. A, it was the Navy Staff Requirement 6/80 Revision Project Falcon. I would like you to read paragraph 2 at the top on page 23. Or rather, let me read it to you. The SA Navy raised the requirement for new surface combat vessels in 1980 in Naval Staff Target 6/80. Project Odward was then registered against National Staff Requirement 6/80, but due mainly to financial reasons, the project remained dormant until 1989 when a new project Foreshore, later Falcon, was launched against NSR 6/80 Revision 1. Now, at this stage, how important were costs and budget?
Chairperson, I think it's right to say that costs and budgets have always been important to the military, and certainly very much so to the Navy. Now, having just come out of a period of essentially land warfare, supported by air warfare, if one can take the struggle and our deployment in what is now Namibia, the Navy had for many years received a very small percentage of the allocation that went to defense, and this is the reason why, since 1980, the Navy had not been able to replace certain combatants. Specifically, how important was budget in this period is possibly illustrated, Chairperson, by the fact that if one looks in 1976, defense received some 4.5% of the GDP. By 1991, this was down to 3%. By 2001, down to 1.5%, and so one can carry on. So there was a very definite downturn in the percentage of GDP that defense was receiving. So in acquiring any vessel, costs which play a major role.
Let's proceed from paragraph 10, where you are now taking us to the white paper in the defense review. In the middle, may I read after Annexure PS4? During 1994 and 1995, 2 tendering rounds were held with international bidders before the process was deferred in May 1995 by the then Minister of Defense. Let's pause there. Who was playing a significant role at this stage? Was it the then government or the new government? Bearing in mind that the interest was still the interest of the South African National Defence Force. That's one thing, but the important player as at that stage, was it the then government or the new government?
Chairperson, it would be the current government.
I would like to complete that sentence.
During 1994 and 1995, 2 tendering rounds were held with international bidders before the process was deferred in May 1995 by the then Minister of Defence in order to await the outcome of the White Paper on Defence and the Defence Review. Chairperson, so at this stage the Navy had, in terms of its staff requirement, redefined the capability that it required. It had stuck to the 4 multi-purpose vessels. And I need to indicate the language that one uses here. One refers to words such as capability, multi-purpose vessels. The nature of acquisition is that the requirement setter says this is the capability I require. This is the functionality I require. This is what this asset needs to do. But the requirement setter does not determine the final asset that is acquired. So we want a capability satisfied, and that's why the language used is in terms of multi-purpose vessel, surface attack vessel. So what eventually then transpired was that the white paper and the defence review were completed, and as this Commission has previously heard, Chair, that through the activities both of compiling the defence review and the consultative process that took place there, as well as the exercise Optimum which was conducted, they confirmed what the Navy had indicated since the 80s, that there was a requirement for frigates. And then eventually this led to the tendering being reopened during the latter part of 1997 and finally culminated in November 1998 when Cabinet approved the German Frigate Consortium as the preferred bidder.
If I were to ask you to draw a distinction between the then process that we know was inter alia informed by National Navy Staff Requirement 6 of 80 and the current strategic defense procurement packages, what would you say? We know that we've gone past 1994, the white paper is in place, the defense review is in place. We're now talking of the strategic defense procurement packages. Now, I would like you, before you delve deeper into your testimony, to distinguish between the two. That process which was regulated on acquisition historically by the Navy Staff Requirement 6/80 and the SDPPs.
Chairperson, the manner in which acquisition was done traditionally was that operational requirements as expressed in staff targets were developed, they were approved, and thereafter further staff work was done, and at the end of that it was handed over to Arms Corps to procure the equipment for us. Now, prior to this period, or even up to this period, the policy document that regulated this was a policy document that was called VB 1000. It was an anagram for Afrikaans, Verkrygingsbeleid or Acquisition Policy 1000. Now, one must understand too, Chairperson, that acquisition, certainly prior to 1990, was largely done in a sanctions-busting environment. I've already alluded to what happened when Resolution 418 was passed. So the manner in which acquisition was done was geared at how to acquire within the ambit of an embargo. So this is the process that took place. Now, also, projects up till then were standalone in as much as the Navy, the Army, or the Air Force would have a requirement to be satisfied, and they would go through this acquisition process. By 1997-98, this changed in as much as suddenly it became a government-to-government acquisition package, if I understand correctly what transpired at this time. And so, whilst in the initial stages in terms of defining the capability shortfall, defining the requirement, the same procedures were taken in the services to get to that point. From the time it actually moved into looking and selecting suppliers, that became a far larger program, with government having a far greater role within that program. And so new policy had to be developed and unfolded during the course of this acquisition, and eventually now led to the new procurement policy, the DAP 1000 policy. But I could not speak to the detail of that policy, not having actually read it.
Thank you. Do not agonize. There's going to be witnesses who are just going to talk to that. I just wanted you to lay foundation, because this transition is very important towards the last part of your testimony. Chairperson, I note that it's 11 o'clock. I don't know whether this is a convenient time for tea, or we proceed without tea today. We are in your hands.
I think we'll adjourn for tea, but then maybe I should mention at this stage that today we are going to adjourn at 1 o'clock. We'll not be sitting in the afternoon. There are other logistical difficulties that we have to attend to. So if you remember, in terms of the guidelines, before we adjourn on Friday, the evidence leaders will have to mention the names of those witnesses that we're going to deal with next week, and they should also mention very briefly the type of evidence that those witnesses are going to deal with. So I just thought that let me remind the evidence leaders that I would expect that to happen just before we adjourn for lunch. Thank you. We'll adjourn now. Does the witness confirm that he's still under oath?
I do, Chairperson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Musi. Admiral Schutz, you have simplified the distinction before we adjourned for us between the process that was regulated by the Naval Staff Request 6/80 and the SDPP packages, which is the subject of this commission. Short of saying, with the Naval Staff Request 6/80, it was a stand-alone process of acquisition equating to where each arm of service would make a request. And in as far as the strategic packages are concerned, the SDPPs, it was a government-to-government request where the whole package stands to get acquisition of these capabilities for all arms of service or more than one arm of service. Am I correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Up to so far, you have also assisted us to appreciate the following: that the frigates request has always been there. Acquisition has always been a process that did not start in the 90s. But earlier on, historically, we had 3 times Type 12 frigates that we bought from France. Am I right?
Chairperson, it is correct as far as that we had 3 frigates in the early 70s, but they were purchased from Britain.
Not from France.
From Great Britain, and the submarines that we had came from France.
Thanks, I stand corrected. Thanks for the correction. And the submarine that we had then were Daphne submarines.
It's correct, Chairperson.
We are talking about the 80s. I just want to appreciate your testimony because we are going into a critical area. During that time, we faced the embargo. We wanted to get more capabilities. We sought 2 times A69 Avisa corvettes from France that we couldn't get. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chairperson.
We also sought the 2 times Augusta-class submarines from France that we could not get. Is that correct?
That is also correct, Chairperson.
At one time or the other, we also sought the Upholder submarines from Great Britain. Is that correct?
Chairperson, that is correct. I do not have much detail, but I believe it was around the mid-90s that there was a unsolicited offer from Great Britain in respect of the upholders.
Now we have Project Citron in place. We are starting to go into the rudiments of the frigates and the submarines, the ones we've acquired under the SDPPs. We have testified that the project that assisted in the acquisition of the frigates is Project Citron, and the project that assisted in the acquisition of the submarines, it's Project Wills. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chairperson.
Now we are going to talk about the current frigates, which are the subject of the SDPPs. They are qualified as MECO A200 frigates. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chairperson.
And the submarines which are the subject of this commission are called Type 209 submarines.
That is also correct, Chairperson.
Let's look at your statement and shoot into the 90s, where we are acquiring these capabilities. We are at the bottom of paragraph. I beg your pardon, Chair. paragraph 10. Might take the liberty to read it to you. We are focusing on the frigates now. The topic is MECO A200 frigates under the SDPP. We're proceeding from there. The topic is the frigates. Following contracting and the build-up program, it's at the bottom of page 3, paragraph 10, Chair Commissioner Musi. Following contracting and the build program, the first of the 4 new MECO A200 frigates was commissioned into the South African Navy in February 2006 and the 4th in March 2007. What does commission mean?
Chairperson, that is the day that they were formally handed over to the South African Navy and were therefore commissioned into service. A warship in commission in terms of international law has to comply with certain prescripts, in that a commissioned ship would be deemed a ship that flies the flag of the state that it belongs to. It has a crew that are subject to a military disciplinary code, and it has an officer commanding who carries the commission of the state. So one can say that's the formal date we took, I say we, in this case the Navy, ownership for the utilization of those ships.
Are you able to be specific about the approximate times when we took them? Reading from the last paragraph, the last sentence that I read to you, it appears that the first one was in February 2006 and the 4th in March 2007. Are you able to catalogue the dates on which they arrived in South Africa consequentially?
Chairperson, I don't have the exact dates that they arrived in South Africa. What I can indicate to the Commission is that these vessels had a two-stage build program, in that the hull and machinery was built in Germany. Our crews went to Germany to train on the operating of, let's say, then the hulls and the propulsion systems. They were then sailed to South Africa. I can give you the dates of the delivery voyages when they left there. The first vessel's delivery voyage it left in October 2003, arriving here in November 2003. That was the SAS Amatola. The second ship, the SAS Isandwana, was the 31st of January 04, arriving here the 23rd of February 04. The third ship was the Spioenkop, which left there in May 04, arriving here 31 January 04. And the last vessel was the Mendi, which departed 20th of August 04, arriving in September 04. Once here, they then had the combat suite and the various weapon systems fitted to them. And they were then handed over, firstly from the consortium to the acquisition department and arms corps, the joint projects team, and finally they were then handed over from the project team to the South African Navy. That handover date for the 4 ships respectively was the 16th of February 2006, the 27th of July 2006, the 16th of February 2007, and the 20th of March 2007, Chair.
We know that we acquired them from the German frigate consortium. At this stage, one doesn't have to bother you about that. There's a particular term of reference which is going to deal with this very sensitive, loaded subject. The issue of who we chose to succeed in the bid, who built them, why, when, the process that took place, why we preferred them, it's still coming. What we know now, what's standing before the Commission, is that We got them from the German Frigate Consortium. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chair.
Page 4, paragraph 11. The topic now, we are focusing on the submarines. We are leaving the frigates for the time being. We know that 4 of them landed in South Africa. We know their names. A testimony has gone through them. Very inclusive testimony yesterday. Paragraph 11 deals with the acquisition of the submarines with a little bit of history at the top. May I take the liberty to read it to you? With respect to the acquisition, Chair, Commissioner Musi, page 4, paragraph 11. With respect to the acquisition of submarines, it should be noted that after the failure to acquire the Augustus in 1977, due to the embargo, is that correct?
Chairperson.
The South African Navy conducted a half-life refit. There comes another project, Project Raka, of its submarines around 1980, and followed this up with a submarine life extension program. 2 projects there, Project Nichols and Fantail in 1989, to ensure that the capability be retained until such time as replacement submarines could be required. Is this rejuvenation?
Chairperson, that is correct. It is rejuvenation and also extension.
I don't know whether you want to delve into these projects, but they explain that there was a need to rejuvenate because there were challenges as the Navy could not acquire better ones or updated ones because of the embargo. Am I right?
Chairperson, that is correct. Certainly the life extension program was because we foresaw that the submarines would have to last us at that stage longer than their normal lifespan of approximately 30 years, and that's why we did what we call a life extension. The half-life refit, as the evidence leader has referred to, was rejuvenation. By then, much of the original electronic equipment fitted to the submarines had become obsolete, and they were primarily analog type equipment, and so we replaced it with homegrown digital equipment. So really it was twofold. The one, to keep them supported, and the other then to extend their life in the event of new submarines not being acquired.
There's a term there on line number 2 called half-life refit that we may come across time and again. We'd like to simplify it in ABC form.
Chairperson, as I indicated, a submarine normally has a lifespan of about 30 years. It can be extended in certain cases. Now, when you purchase it, it comes with certain equipment, and as time steps on, some of that equipment may no longer be available because factories that originally produced them have also moved on. There may also be other challenges in the world of the military, evolving threats that ship was not originally equipped to contend with. And so we conduct what we call a half-life refit, roughly in the middle of the lifespan, in which we then either upgrade the vessel for new challenges and also upgrade the vessel in terms of equipment that has become obsolete. So it is purely a mechanism to rejuvenate the vessel for the remaining part of its life, and also to give it added capabilities if so required.
Paired with this term half-life repeat time and again, there's a term called obsolete and a concept called obsolescence. That term, we're going to hear it time and again in the later stages. Would you like to simplify it in ABC?
Chair, simply either equipment becomes obsolescent in that it can no longer be acquired, or equipment can become obsolescent in that it can no longer deal with an emerging threat. In both cases, one then seeks to find an alternative to that obsolescent piece of equipment. And obsolescent equipment is then disposed of, but it can also refer not only to a piece of equipment on a particular ship or submarine, it can also refer to a whole platform, a whole submarine or a whole ship in itself becoming obsolescent and having to be replaced. A third aspect of obsolescence can be when the cost of ownership becomes extremely high due to the fact that equipment is obsolescent. So the cost of maintaining it actually becomes more than acquiring a new one. And in that case, we would also term it as obsolescent.
We're still on the self-same paragraph 11. I would like to read from line number 6, starting with it. It is my understanding. Are you with me? Are the commissioners with me? Please draw my attention. Are the commissioners with me? I'm looking at you. Please draw my attention. I'm looking at you. I thought you could see whether the commissioners are on the same paragraph with us, but I'm sensing that they are. May I proceed? It is my understanding that around 1996, efforts were also made to acquire 3 Upholder-class submarines from the United Kingdom. You've explained that part and the challenges that arose out of that. I, however, have no knowledge of the detail of this effort, as I have not seen any source documentation on this endeavor. However, in September 1999, Cabinet announced that South Africa was to get 3 new submarines as part of the evolving Strategic Defense Equipment Package Initiative. A preliminary staff requirement 1/1999 was submitted in November 1999 and formed the baseline against which the new submarines were eventually acquired under Project Wills. Now, we've laid a foundation for all these concepts, staff requirements, but at this stage, let's pause. What's the relationship between the preliminary staff requirement 1 of 1999 and the SDPP packages?
Chairperson, my understanding is that where in the past the staff requirements preceded packages, this staff requirement, 1 of 99, in fact, was written after the announcement by Cabinet that South Africa would be receiving new submarines.
Let's proceed to read on. After you mentioned that they were acquired under Project Wills, you refer to Annexure PS6, dated 6 January 2000, being a submission from the chairperson of the AACB to the chairperson of the AASB seeking approval for the acquisition of 3 submarines approved by Cabinet on 15 September 1999. The Commission is going to hear a lot about AACB, standing for the Armaments Acquisition Control Board. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chairperson.
And the AASB stands for the Armaments Acquisition Supporting Board. Am I right?
Chairperson, I understand it to be the Armament Acquisition Steering Board, but I can't speak on the board.
Actually, you're correct. It is the Armaments Acquisition Steering Board. At this stage, do not bother about it. The distinction between them is one is chaired by the Defense Secretary, and the other one is chaired by the Chief of Staff, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct.
Do you want to take us through Annexure PS6, pages 68 to 70, if need be? Annexure PS6, pages 68 to 70.
On page 68, this is much of what has just been read. Just paragraph 1 indicates that the White Paper of Defence and also the Defence Review of 1998 both confirmed the requirement for South Africa to have a submarine capability. Also, as was indicated yesterday, it in fact postulated that the requirement was for 4 submarines. That same paragraph also indicates that in September 1999, the Cabinet had made the announcement that we were to get new submarines. Over the page, on page 69, I would just like to touch on paragraph 4, which shows that by this time the Daphne submarines that we had received from France were already 29 years old. So they were well due for replacement at this time. Again, also in paragraph 5, it just once again affirms the fact that this was not something new. This was, and the Defence Review affirmed the earlier requirement that we'd also looked at when we tried to acquire the 2 additional or 2 Augusta submarines in the mid-70s. And then possibly paragraph 6, Chairperson, which says the fact is that although we had carried out a half-life refit under Project Raka around 1980, and although we had carried out a submarine life extension program towards the end of 1989, these submarines could not continue forever, and that by the year 2005, the cost of operating these submarines would start to escalate. This was mainly because at that stage we were reaching the point where we were the last country still operating this type of submarine, and so spares would become an issue. Now, cost is but one factor that one can mention. The other factor, of course, becomes operational utilization or utility, because if spares are that short, it means if something breaks, you could wait a very long time until you actually sourced a spare or had to establish a production line to manufacture that particular part. And in that time, you would then not have the capability.
Is that the inception of obsolescence at that time? Am I correct?
That is correct, Chairperson. These submarines, by 2005, in terms of the definitions I gave for obsolescence, we deemed that they would start to become obsolete.
Yes, you may proceed, sir, to read. We took you to paragraph 11, annexure PS 6, dated 6 January 2000. Just complete the sentence starting with on the self-same paragraph, or rather, let's expedite time. This, may I please read it to you? This document noted that if the Daphne submarines were not replaced by 2005, the country would lose its submarine capability, and once lost, this capability would be extremely difficult and costly to recover in terms of vessels, infrastructure, and most importantly, expertise. You have mentioned this, your colleague Admiral Green mentioned this, your colleague Admiral Hicks mentioned this. Paragraph 12 relates to the arrival of the submarines. You have dealt with that. Paragraph 13 comes to the nub of the challenges created by costs. It should be noted that cost constraints resulted in the projects not providing through life logistics support for the ships and submarines, but only for the anticipated first 3 to 5 years of utilization, after which the operating budget was to provide for future sparing, equipment, and life cycle support. Now, this is technical. Please simplify it for the Commission.
The gist of what I've tried to indicate here in my statement is that traditionally, when one purchased military hardware, because of the nature of the hardware and the very often limited scope of supply of such hardware, you would purchase a ship or aircraft or any other hardware with sufficient spares to last for the anticipated life cycle. And the life cycle meaning the number of years that you expect this vessel or asset to be in service. For instance, if by way of analogy, the strike-craft that we refer to that we bought in the early 70s, we still have 5 to 6 engines that we've never taken out of their package. So we bought the engines that we foresaw we would use throughout the life. We bought the gun mountings that we, with normal use, one could expect to use throughout 30 years. So that's the concept of buying in your life cycle support as part of the project. However, for two reasons. The one, cost constraints. Obviously, if you do that, it makes the project very expensive up front, and then the costs over the life is less. If you do not do that, then the project is cheaper up front, but the costs accruing over the life cycle of it then becomes higher. So in this case, firstly, because under the packages there was a very definite fixed ceiling that could not be exceeded, we did not buy sparing for or spares and support for the full life of these vessels, but only for the first 3 to 5 years of operating. However, one must also recognize that these ships are vessels from the electronics era, and electronics goes obsolete a lot quicker than in the days when computers were mechanical or analog. And so that was another reason that we did not spare through life, because one would then find that you're faced with possible obsolescence of the equipment. So that really is the concept why we only bought 3 to 5 years utilization, and the understanding at the time would be that once the vessels arrive, there would be adjustments to the operating budget of certainly the Navy, and that operating budget would then have to pick up the cost for future life cycle support, both in the running costs, the normal running costs, but also in terms of sparing.
Does the fact that we were not facing sanctions and were not under the embargo influence the decision just to get this space only for 3 to 5 years?
Chairperson, I would speculate about that. All I could indicate was that certainly from a cost point, we realized that we could not purchase more. The fact that we were now in a sanction-free environment certainly made it possible to adopt this approach, where in the past it would not have been readily possible to adopt this approach.
Let's read further. Similarly, the partial acquisition plan reflected that a spiral upgrade program commencing some 15 years after arrival of the vessels in South Africa would be initiated to address obsolescence. With hindsight, the period of 15 years has proved to be too long in the light of technological redundancy, and we have already commenced on upgrade projects. Do you want to comment?
Chairperson, two issues here. We recognized that equipment would have to be upgraded within a certain time frame, firstly, and secondly, in purchasing these ships within the ceiling, there were, and this is another technical term, what we called fitted for but not with equipment on board the ship. So you would provide, let's say, the cabling to fit a certain piece of equipment at the end of that cable later on. And the intention was then that the spiral upgrade, and the spiral just here shows that it would be evolutionary. As time went on, we would do certain upgrades, both to address those deficiencies, or not necessarily deficiencies, but those items that we would have liked to have procured up front but could not afford at the time. So that was part of the spiral upgrade. And then other part of the spiral upgrade was that as certain equipments became redundant or improved, we would purchase those for the ships. And what we have found that in certain areas there are already upgrades available for the equipment, and as manufacturers provide a upgraded version, obviously then they don't continue necessarily stocking the old equipment. So we have found that it is necessary to bring forward some of these programs, and we have registered a project both for the frigates and the submarines to start the spiral upgrade process.
Does this involve a costly exercise that affects the budget?
Chairperson, these being projects, they will be run on the Folio 2 or Special Defence account, and they have been budgeted for within that environment, and they will also be multi-year in their execution. They do not come out of the operating budget that I alluded to earlier. But this is also a normal procedure. In essence, earlier I spoke about a half-life refit. This is a spiral upgrade similar to a half-life, but instead of taking place at one point, it takes place over a number of years, also to carry costs over many years.
The vernacular of what we see from paragraph 14 goes to the nub of your testimony. You will note that there are critics who will come at a later stage or may not come at a later stage. They have already positively addressed their criticism that we are not utilizing this equipment or going into the technical aspects of utilization. But from paragraph 14, you are laying a foundation towards the real statistics and formulas and ratios of utilization. May I read from paragraph 14? In addressing the utilization of the frigates and submarines, a number of general comments need to be made prior to addressing specifics. Firstly, paragraph 15, page 5, Commissioners. Firstly, as early as November 2002, it was already recognized that the frigate utilization as defined in Naval Staff Requirement 6 of 80, let's pause there. Is this Naval Staff Requirement 6 of 80 still applicable, and explain why?
Chairperson, it certainly is still applicable because it was the source document or the document of origin where the requirement was first set out in 1980. However, as I've tried to indicate in earlier testimony given, that this requirement over time, due to its non-satisfaction, was adjusted in as much as there was a revision 1 as well as a revision 2. So when I refer there to Naval Staff Target 6 of 80, it is to the latest revision that Wills was then, Project Wills was then initiated to satisfy.
I beg your pardon. Let's read further. I've got to go back so that, we should make sense to make these ends to meet, because I can't take it. It's free floating, standing on its own. Let's go back to where the paragraph starts. Firstly, as early as November 2002, it was already recognized that the frigate utilization as defined in Naval Staff Requirement 6 of 80 would not be possible under the South African Navy's then budget allocation. As a result, a new operational profile was proposed for basing, sparing, and hence future utilization on. Do you want to explain that?
Chairperson, in November or on and about November 2002, That was the period when I was the Director of Maritime Plans at Naval Headquarters, and as I indicated yesterday, responsible for the compilation of the Navy's budget, in as much as this is the allocation you've received, these are the tasks required of you, how would one therefore allocate it to the various units. Now, at that time, the project team were over in Germany and also a certain office here, and they were running through the various phases of the project. And one such phase was the life cycle analysis, and therefore also the determination of what would be required in terms of stockholding to support these vessels for their utilization. The basis on which they calculate what stockholding is required depends on, firstly, the manufacturer's advice in terms of things like mean time between failure for equipment that one can expect, but also on utilization. Because if one looks at maintenance and repairs of ships, there's different types of maintenance that gets done. There's time-based maintenance. Every 1 month you do this, every 6 months you do that, 12 months, and so on. But then there's also what we call running hour maintenance, when certain, especially revolving machinery, have done a certain number of hours, then you have to do certain maintenance to them. And that type of maintenance is heavily reliant on information of how you're going to be operating that ship. How many days do you expect to see that ship at sea per annum? How many days do you expect that ship to be operational alongside? How long do you expect the ship to go on a mission at one time? What is the dependability that you want when you're on such a mission? And what is the equipment dependability? So it's a fairly complex field of logistics analysis. And this was brought to the Navy office by the project team. And in terms of that which had been specified in the Naval Staff Requirement 6 of 80, and they said this is what the Navy said when they wanted to purchase these ships. This ship must be capable of spending so many days at sea. It must be capable of being available so many days. That detail of what was given to us is on page 72, Chairperson. Just waiting. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have to. Let's follow the sequence of your testimony because we're still laying a foundation. That's a critical part. We will get to those mechanical and technical ratios and days and calculations. At this stage, this background is very significant for the Commission to appreciate the processes involved in as far as operations and operational profiles are concerned. Let's read further. This new operation profile produced number of days OPS available, comma. What does OPS stands for?
The number of days that the vessel has to be available for the conduct of operations. In practical terms, it means the vessel can be either at sea doing an exercise, it could be at sea doing a passage, but it could also be alongside in a harbor ready to be sent. So it is available for utilization. Essentially, it is not in a maintenance cycle.
Comma, the sea days per annum and the total mission duration for the 4 ships to 146 days per annum. I know that this is technical. We're going to simplify it for the Commission to appreciate it. I refer to the document attached, marked Annexure PS7, that is on pages 71 to 74. Before we go to pages 71 to 74, do you want to simplify that which I've just read to you now?
Thank you, Chair. All I'm indicating here, sir, is that with regards to the ship, they've given us the project indicator operational profile, and that profile said these ships you must maintain and prepare that for a certain number of days of the year they will be available for utilization. A certain number of days per year you must be able to utilize them at sea, and you must be able to send them on operations for a certain number of days. So it's really just different categories of utilization of the ship or readiness states of the vessels. I need to indicate that these days that are allocated, Chair, drives your costs very much in terms of operating, because the higher the number of days that they must be available, and there's another term that will come in later in terms of the readiness that they must be maintained at. We call it the notice for sea. The shorter the notice, the higher the cost, because it means if your notice is 1 hour, if it breaks now, you've got to fix it immediately. It means your technicians have to stay literally on board. If the notice for sea is a week, then they don't have to be on board. So these concepts underlie the cost drivers of operating a ship.
Please go to page 71 to 74, Annexure PS7. Let's start on page 72. Page 72. I see this document has been prepared by you. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Look at the bottom of page 72. P shoots Director Maritime Plans, colon, RAMD JG, standing, I suppose, for Rear Admiral JG Junior? Junior grade. Now let's go back to page 71. The date is 11 November 2002. By that date, were the submarines and the frigates already in the country?
They were not yet here, Chairperson.
Now, I just want you to demonstrate to the Commission the relevance of this important document in as far as space is concerned. You may proceed.
Chairperson, as I indicated that during the build program, the project teams were developing the life cycle support requirements for these ships. And so the project team approached the Navy and said, on the basis of the staff requirement and the days that these ships must be available, here is the proposed sparing for such vessel. Now, the data that they used is found on page 72, which was an extract of the naval staff requirement. In the table there, Chairperson, where it says naval staff requirement 6 of 80, that staff requirement said that these ships should be available 260 days of the year for operational utilization. That does not imply that they must be utilized 260 days each. It implies they must be ready to be utilized each, if I can draw that distinction, sir. Secondly, it said that each of these ships should spend some 180 days per annum at sea. And in terms of going away on missions, each ship should do a 28-day mission. And then it carries on to give dependability figures and reliability figures. Chairperson, if I may then go back to the preceding page, page 71. Having looked at that, they also inter alia, down in paragraph 4, said in order to spare the ships for this period and to conform to these levels of utilization, the Navy would have to buy additional spares of about 111 million rand, paragraph 4A. It would have to establish certain maintenance capabilities, and it specifically refers there to a certain level with regards to one of the radars and the surface-to-surface missile that we acquired, as well as to buy a fifth dual-purpose gun at a further cost of 239 million rand. Furthermore, paragraph C, from the financial year 6 and 7, we would have to procure spares annually at the value of 51 million rand, and at the same time establish maintenance contracts to the value of 69 million rand, as per paragraph D. Chair, at that time, in 2002, looking at the budget that was allocated to the Navy in terms of operating, it was clear that we could not meet this requirement. So, although the staff requirement indicated the utilization, funding did not permit that tempo of utilization. And so, if one then looks on page 5, paragraph 5 on page 72, the second half of the table I earlier referred to, the proposal that I made was that we reduce the days operationally available to 130 days, that we reduce the sea days, as you can see indicated there, Chairperson, to a total of 310 days. In other words, one ship would spend 100 days potentially at sea. Two of the vessels would spend 80 days at sea, and the third vessel 50 days in a year. Chairperson, I need to indicate here, these are aggregates to base sparing on. That does not mean that ship 1 must do 100 days, ship 2 80 days. We're allowing for that number of vessels. So if a vessel was in an extended maintenance cycle, another vessel could potentially do its days, because this is purely for a costing model that I'm showing here. And then as far as mission duration, the third line of the table, Chair, the total there, 131 days mission duration. And this was then approved in principle by the then Chief of the Navy, who was Vice Admiral Retief at the time. And this data was passed through to the project team, which are the follow-on documentations from page 73 through to 74 would indicate how this was then passed on for the project team to build their sparing model around that. And we then, as the Navy, I wrote back on page 74 to Chief of the Navy on the 6th of May 2003 to say that we have now passed this on to the project teams, and they will use that for future sparing, and what the impact on the Navy's budget would be. And that was May 2003.
I'm certain that we've been lost the commission, and the commission is with us. If you look at this document on page 71, the subject is Project Citron, sparing for the coverts. We're talking about the frigates. Am I correct?
That is correct.
For instance, paragraph 16, paragraph 15 on page 5 also refers to utilization of the frigates and the challenges. Am I right?
Correct, Chair.
You were talking to the spare parts in as far as the frigates are concerned, and the adjustment to be made in order to get them to go to sea in line with the cost and budget. Is that correct?
Chairperson, what I was referring to here was to say that in terms of the project deliverable by the project team who have to deliver that which is contained in the staff requirement, they build to that specification. They had indicated to us what the sparing would be required, what spares would be required to conform to that specification. Because the operating budget could not carry that load, we therefore proposed an amendment to the specification in terms of utilization so that we could have a lower costing figure in terms of spares to be purchased. This did not deal with the future utilization, but merely the ability to utilize in the future, which was now being reduced in terms of space.
Now, let me simplify it so that we should be on the same page. Permit me to give this example. You are saying, we know that it's the project team that advised accordingly. If you have to go to the sea for 100 days, you'll adjust and make it a point that you get space for 50 days. Now, that would reduce sparing, and that would automatically reduce utilization. Am I right?
That is correct.
That's the theme of what is being demonstrated here. Am I right?
That is correct, Chair.
Now, you've laid the foundation. The relevancy of this comes when we want to deal with costs and budget and how far we go to try and accommodate and adjust and make it a point that this equipment is being utilized. But let's go to the nub, because we are talking about 11 November 2002 to lay a foundation when the frigates and the submarines are in South Africa. Now, we've laid this foundation about sparing. Now, let's shoot. Paragraph 16. Please read.
Paragraph 16 reads, it has to be indicated that the platform types or the vessel types are extremely complex platforms and or vessels. And in particular with regards to the frigates, I'd like to indicate that there were many unique features on board these ships which the Navy had not previously encountered. For instance, by way of example, this was the first time that naval vessels in the South African Navy service would be equipped with air-to-air missiles. It was the first time that the South African Navy introduced gas turbines as propulsion, as well as the first time that we introduced a water jet. And so there were a number of other unique features to these ships which the South African Navy encountered now for the first time and had to come to grips with in terms of operating and maintaining.
Now, a foundation is being laid that up to so far there are two aspects that affect utilization. We are trying to demonstrate and show the Commission that inclusive in utilization is a number of variables. Firstly, we know that the spare parts affect utilization. We also know that costs affect utilization. But even the disposition, the complexity of these equipment affect utilization. Go to paragraph 17.
Chairperson, paragraph 17 speaks to the complexity of systems and the fact that it takes us a number of years to master this complexity completely. And even though now we've had these ships for a number of years, we are still in the process of developing a detailed understanding of many of these systems. I would like to, by way of anecdote, indicate that this is nothing new and nothing strange. When we bought the Daphne submarines from the French, I understand it took us almost 10 years before we fully understood how the torpedoes worked. When we bought the strike craft from the Israelis, it took us 6 to 7 years to discover how the missiles worked. Because very often when you purchase, people are reluctant to give you the source code. They don't give you the source code, and when things do not work, you actually have to figure it out for yourself. Why? So there are 2 examples in our earlier history where it took us time. And in the same way, these frigates are merely indicating that there are complexities. And each day you're discovering more about these systems and getting a greater knowledge. Now, obviously, where something lies undiscovered, it takes time to resolve if there's an issue. And that's what that paragraph speaks to.
Well, the paragraph tells us that these are machines which are complicated, they're man-made, and they're made in foreign countries. For you to master them, it's a process. Am I right?
That is correct, Chair.
We've seen another aspect that affects utilization. Please look at paragraph 18. Please read paragraph 18.
Paragraph 18 speaks to how we now operate this vessel once we receive it. And we say that whether it's a ship or a submarine, it's managed by the Navy within an operating cycle, just a term we use, and that cycle allows for periods when the ship is operationally available, during which it can be utilized, but also for periods when the ship is not operationally available, when it's in a maintenance period. So then, broadly speaking, when a ship is in an operational cycle, the type of activities or subdivisions of those activities. The first one is force preparation period. So this is when you take a ship and you take the ship through safety and readiness checks, and I will allude to that later in my statement, sir, what this entails. There are times when you use that ship on its own for it to train itself up and exercise on its own. And then there are times when we combine that ship with other naval assets and we do what we would call Navy unique multi-ship exercises. So these are all activities in order to prepare the ship to be utilized for its various stated roles. A chairperson then, having done that, the ship is available to be employed, and the employment inter alia consists of the conduct of certain operations, like, for instance, the patrols that we do around the coast, the patrol we're doing in Mozambique, and other operations. There are times when there are certain audit commitments that we are engaged in. Yesterday, one example was, for instance, where the ship acted as a platform for international negotiations. Another typical audit commitment would be hydrography. One could not really call surveying an operation, but it's certainly an audit commitment that we have for the Navy. And then there are joint and multinational exercises. Chairperson, just to define that, a joint exercise would be where we are exercising in consort with the Air Force, the Army, the medical services, and multinational exercises where we would exercise with those services, but also with members from other navies and their vessels. So essentially then, that's your force preparation side and also your force employment side. Then, to make sure that the ships remain available in order to do these activities, there are a number of maintenance periods. Chairperson, if I may proceed to those. The first period that a ship enters into is a so-called self-maintenance period, and this is where the members on board the ship's crew, conduct routine maintenance and minor maintenance on board the ship themselves. There are also assisted maintenance periods where the level of maintenance is slightly more complex, the tasks take slightly longer, and in this regard they are then assisted by the uniform maintenance capability that resides within our fleet command. Thereafter, there is what we would call a docking and essential defect period. And this is the first time where we also engage our dockyard to assist. Again, the depth of maintenance that is done is a deeper depth. We speak about levels 1, 2, 3, 4, but that's not really pertinent, sir. But the difference between the docking and essential defects and the previous ones really lies there in that this is the time when we also do the underwater work that you cannot do whilst the ship is lying alongside. So the ship comes out of the water either by going onto a synchro lift or being docked. And then the last period that we use is the refit period, where a ship is then given a complete overhaul, so to speak. Chairperson, the cycle in which it normally operates is that the ship would be operationally available. In that period, there would be time for a self-maintenance period and assistance maintenance period. And then it would stop being operationally available for those periods. And it would repeat that. And then after 3 to 4 cycles, it will go into a docking and defect. And then the whole cycle repeats. And after the second docking and essential defect, there would be a refit. So the whole cycle can be up to 8 years. Now, I need to indicate that a self-maintenance period can be as short as a week, and a refit can be as long as 2 years. Thank you, Chair.
The themes of what you say is that utilization is inclusive. We are seeing the fourth analogy as to what would be included in utilization, from operational cycle, how you operate these ships when you receive them. The ship should be available. Sometimes it's not available. It doesn't mean it is not operational. It must be prepared. It must be employed. It must be maintained. It goes into refit cycle. From your understanding, would you say that the understanding of utilization by a common man like myself, ordinary person, is different from that which is understood by yourself and people in the Navy?
Chairperson, I believe that is a true statement.
And it not even complete some of the technical things that you say, because the real utilization is when you deal with the statistics and it's coming below. Now let's look at the fifth aspect that influence utilization, paragraph 19. Page 6, paragraph 19.
There I'm referring to the fact that historically, when we operated the Daphne submarines, although we had 3 submarines, 2 of them were primarily kept in the operating cycle, whilst the 3rd submarine was being kept in administrative commission. And in fact, even now we follow the same principle, and our 1st submarine is currently engaged in a first-of-class refit. Chairperson, I need to indicate that this has also been reported formally in February 2011 to the Portfolio Committee of Defence, where we indicated in questions that the Navy will have 1 submarine in a maintenance cycle and 2 submarines in an operating cycle, that the period for such a refit is approximately 30 months, and that the submarines will do a refit approximately every 8 years.
Is there an instance where all 3 of them would be operational, as in available on a voyage?
Chairperson, it is possible, but it would not be the norm, and it would normally come about as a result of program slides, either to the left or right of certain maintenance cycles. So we would endeavor to have 2 available in the operating cycle, 1 in a refit, and then at certain times you could even have a gap where one would be doing a self-maintenance period of a week whilst the other vessel is available. So these are very much program-driven activities.
Admiral, should please simplify it in ABC. Why is that so?
Chairperson, the simplest way to say this really would be that, yes, from a technical point of view, we establish what is called a hull availability program, which lists all the vessels and indicates when what vessel must go into what phase of maintenance and when it's available. There are times when operations are then scheduled, necessitating that asset, and therefore the program then gets adjusted irrespective of that particular ship. And that, if it relies on the dock for the particular activity that's rescheduled, then there will be a commensurate knock-on effect. So although one would like to be as fixed in your maintenance program, because that impacts also on resources like the dockyard, operational necessities very often necessitates a change to those programs, as well as lead times in procuring equipment and also in contracting.
So if the critics were to come and say, we see these capabilities at the dockyard, they are not moving, they're static, would it be fair? Because those are the conclusions that come in, that they're inoperable and they're not being utilized.
Chairperson, I don't believe that would be fair, because as I've indicated, operational available can also be lying alongside awaiting an assignment. And if there was no assignment to go and do, then just to steam around outside would be pointless, quite frankly.
Paragraph 20, the sixth factor.
This paragraph speaks to the responsibility of the Navy. It also speaks to the responsibility of the Chief of Joint Operations and how we prepare the vessels and how we then utilize the vessels. And herein too lies in part the answer to the previous question posed to me. Currently, in terms of the design of the National Defence Force, the Chief of the Navy is responsible to prepare forces. So we are responsible, therefore, sir, to do the required maintenance routines to our ships and submarines. We are responsible, sir, to make sure that those forces are trained up and are capable of conducting various missions. We are, however, in other words, Chairperson, we are responsible that the forces are operationally available. We are not responsible for utilization of those forces in as much as the conduct of operations are concerned, because the conduct of operations is a task that the Chief of the National Defence Force has delegated to the Chief of Joint Operations. And I would like to, with your permission, Chair, then to just elucidate more around the Department of Defence's annual business plan, because the business plan contains that which the Navy is to prepare. And if I may indicate where we are at present. Each year, the Chief of Joint Operations prepares a document for the Chief of the National Defence Force, which indicates the short-term force employment requirements. Now, those requirements that he prepares, he does so on the basis of the threat analysis that is done by the intelligence community. They do it on the basis of knowledge of forthcoming events within the country, and they do it on the basis of standing commitments. So, taking these factors into consideration, short-term force employment guidelines are presented. And those short-term force employment guidelines tells each service, including the Navy, what ships it must provide. For instance, at present, and I apologize, Chair, for some of the terms, but we are told with regards to the frigates right now that we must have one frigate at what is termed a functional level of capability. In other words, one frigate must be fully fit for its war-fighting role. We must have one frigate at the basic level of capability. That means it can do a number of tasks, but not necessarily a full war-fighting role. One frigate at a seagoing level of capability, again, that it can go to sea, do limited tasks, but it's safe to go to sea, and one frigate at no level of capability. That would classically be the vessel that is in a major refit period. And similarly, Chairperson, with regards to the submarines, there are instructions as to how many must be at a functional level or full level of capability, a safe level or seagoing level of capability, and no level of capability. So trying to indicate these requirements are both cost-driven but also needs-driven. Admiral Higgs yesterday alluded to defence being expensive. If we are to keep all 4 frigates at the highest level of capability all the time, it would be prohibitive. And the question would be, why? So it is against that background and that instruction that the Navy would then prepare vessels. And so when the question is asked, why are the vessels not utilized, the answer is twofold. One, was it available for utilization? And secondly, was there a requirement for such utilization? These are 2 separate questions, I believe, Chair.
With that background, we are now going to talk to the real utilization. We have been educated through the 6 fundamental premises that inform utilization. We've seen that it's inclusive, it's not a perception, it gets to be technical and mechanical. And Chair, it's 7 minutes to 1. We are really going into the figures, the exercises, the missions, what these capabilities do, how far they go, the training of the crew, what they execute in terms of the defense goals and tasks. And it will be the last portion of Admiral Schutz's testimony. I suppose you appreciate why we started where we started, demonstrating that acquisition is historical. These processes have been influenced even before 1994, even before the SDPP packages. We've tried to demonstrate that utilization is inclusive, it's not subject to perceptions. We're now at the stage where we want to demonstrate the real utilization. I'm willing to use this 5 minutes to proceed to refer you to the annexures, the times, unless you're of the view that this is the appropriate time to adjourn.
Advocate Lwala, maybe this might be an appropriate time to adjourn. And as I said, we'll only come back on Monday morning. Is it not time that you should perhaps deal with the question of witnesses that are going to be called next week, together with a brief statement of what those witnesses are going to testify about?
Well, Chair, on our part, we just want to call one witness next week, and we'll explain to you why. We envisage that we'd call a witness, Captain Jordan, who's going to talk to the process that will demonstrate to the Commission that the SDPPs were informed by a process and how that process unfolded. There's a cut-off point to his testimony because from a certain stage the process gets higher. AMSCO gets to be involved up until Cabinet makes a decision. We envisage calling a witness also who will demonstrate that in as far as the Navy and the Air Force is concerned, the process was clean because the Inspector General found that all these processes, after being subjected to audit, they were not controversial. That will be another leg. But we envisage calling 2 witnesses next week, subject to how we will agree with our team headed by Ms. Ramahaha and Advocate Mpaha and Advocate Sello and Advocate Sibeko. We are certain, and Advocate Zondi, we are certain that we want to bring these capabilities before you so that you should appreciate them and see them. We can't talk about them in the abstract. Now, there's been a debate within our team as to is it where we should have started by projecting them on the screen. But we thought that the fact that they've been acquired, you've heard about them, we need to unravel them and concretize them by manifesting them so that you could see and touch them sometime next week. So we intend leading a witness who will be talking to them and showing them to you, certainly next week. From there we may cut off and our colleagues might proceed with the Air Force, but we'll decide that. The Air Force might start next week. So the witness that we intend calling, we already told you that is going to talk to the projection and manifestation of this equipment so that you should appreciate them. And if need be, it might be Captain Jordan to talk about the process. But we're debating with our team that would it be appropriate at this stage. So anyone who wants to enjoy the benefit is for them to know the following. Admiral Christine might be called just to come and talk to these capabilities next week, and or Captain Jordan, subject to where we intend putting. We might put Captain Jordan to talk about the process before AMSCO comes in, after the witnesses led by Ms. Ramahaha and Advocate Mpaha have testified, including Advocate Sibeko and Advocate Sello, probably, and Advocate Zondi, having led their witnesses. For our part, standing here, we envisage 2 witnesses with a likelihood of certainly calling 1.
Advocate Lawal, can I suggest this? Probably talk to your colleagues when we adjourn. Prepare a very short statement about what each witness is going to testify about and how many witnesses do you intend calling next week as a team, and post that on our website. In other words, we want to make sure that by tomorrow, at least the public knows who's going to testify next week and what sort of evidence is likely to be given by those witnesses.
Chair, Mr. Mahaha's team is here, and in actual fact, I was indirectly putting them on the spot to address you. The statement has been given, and I think they're qualified to address you. Permit me to give you over to them. May I hand over to them to address you?
That I understand. Just make sure that all of you as a team, you post on our website the names of witnesses who are going to testify next week, together with a very short statement indicating what evidence each witness is going to deal with.
Chairperson, the South African Air Force team does have the list of witnesses that will be called next week, as well as the summaries of those respective witnesses. And with your permission, may I place on record the summaries of those witnesses?
Okay, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson and Commissioner Musi. In the next week, commencing on the 26th day of August 2013, we will present the evidence of 4 witnesses from the Air Force Arm of Service, and those witnesses are Generals Malinga, Bain, Berger, as well as Colonel Viljoen. Now, General Malinga will give a broad overview of the mandate of the South African National Defence Force as encapsulated in Section 200, subsection 2 of Act 108 of 1996, that is the Constitution, and the functions of the South African National Defence Force set out in Section 227, subsection 1 of Act 200 of 1993, the interim constitution. In his testimony, he will give historical background of the South African Air Force, for example, when it was formed, and then proceed to deal with the capabilities of the South African Air Force. When these systems were acquired, the countries from which they were purchased, and when they were phased out. He will deal with budget cuts that occurred in the early 1990s and post-1994, and the impact this had on the South African Air Force. In his evidence, General Malinga will also make reference to the white paper and the national defense, on the national defense for the Republic, and to the Defense Review of 1998. He will also elaborate on the defense strategic objectives, force design, the force design options insofar as they relate to the South African Air Force. The greater part of General Malinga's testimony will focus on the rationale for the strategic defense procurement packages and the training philosophy of the South African Air Force, which seems to have informed the decisions with regard to the aircraft to be acquired, including the helicopters. General Bain will give detail on the 3-tier combat training system of the South African Air Force and how it was implemented in practice prior to the acquisition of the strategic defense procurement packages. He will allude to the aging fleets of aircraft that the South African Air Force had in the mid-1990s and the debates that ensued over the replacement of these systems. General Bain will elaborate on the need to maintain a capability as in relatively peaceful environment. He will also focus on the processes that culminated in the decision by Cabinet in November 1998 to acquire the lead-in fighter trainer and the advanced light fighter aircraft from BAE and SAAB, respectively. In his testimony, General Bain will deal at length with the role and capabilities of these aircraft. Greater part of his evidence will shed light on how these aircraft systems are utilized, personnel operating and maintaining these systems, accidents and incidents that have occurred in respect of these aircrafts. General Berger will set out the history of the South African Air Force helicopter system, when the first helicopter squadron was formed, and the types of helicopters it had on its inventory, and the purpose for which these systems were acquired. He will delve on the requirement for and description of the light utility helicopters, the processes that ensued to satisfy this requirement. For example, staff targets, staff requirements, etc. The greater part of General Berger's testimony will focus on the roles and capabilities of the light utility helicopters, the accidents involving the system that have occurred since its delivery, the exercises and operations in which the system was deployed, the current status of the helicopters. With regard to utilization, General Berger's evidence will shed light on the number of hours the light utility helicopters has flown, the cooperating costs and personnel, both air and ground crew, trained to operate and maintain the system. And the last witness to testify will be Colonel Viljoen. He will give an overview on the state of the Alouette 3 helicopters in the 1990s. These helicopters were replaced with the Augusta helicopters, which were purchased as part of the strategic defense procurement packages. When this system was acquired, he will deal in great detail with the acquisition process that ensued to replace the Alouette, the companies that tendered to supply helicopters to South Africa, the type of engine offered by the tenderers of this capability. Colonel Viljoen will also touch on his stint at the Augusta helicopter facility in Italy between May 2000 and December 2003, during which time the project engineering processes were concluded. Those are the summaries of the witnesses earmarked to be brought in the coming week, Mr. Chairperson.
Thank you, Ms. Ramaphosa. I think now we'll adjourn until Monday morning, and we'll start at 9:30. Thank you.